Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. We have Keith Campbell, who is a professor of psychology at University of Georgia, as well as the author of the new Science of Narcissism, understanding one of the greatest psychological challenges of our time and what you can do about it. So this is a personal question that I have. Um, I've had so many interesting little tidbits with my own personal life. One is, so I wanted to see if you can answer them because I've just always been curious about them. One is when you have friends who just talk about themselves during the entire conversation. And sometimes my husband and I come back like, were they not raised right? Like, what, what just happened during that conversation? And then sometimes I'll think, I just felt like I was in a podcast where I could not hit pause at all. So what is that narcissism and just bad social skills? What does one do
Yeah.
when they're in that scenario?
Well, I mean, that is narcissism. So there's this work on narcissistic conversational styles. And one of the things you see is people will turn the conversation back to themselves.
Yes.
So, oh, that's enough about you, CJ. Did I tell you about my new car? Or did you know my kids at Princeton? Oh, I mean, it's that kind of thing. Oh, there's a bird. Did I tell you about my private jet? It
Yeah.
flies too.
Yeah.
So there is that process in narcissism, because if you're narcissistic, you want to talk about yourself. It's a
Right.
way of feeling good and getting status. I I tend to just wind people up because I get bored, and I'm just like, I'll wind them up and see what I'm curious about. And I'll just ask them about whatever I'm curious about, whatever their job is. Tell me about your job, tell me about your car, whatever they're into, just because I get curious and wind them up. Um, People have very poor conversational skills. Often they didn't learn about turn taking, and the art of
Right.
conversation is something that isn't taught, the way I was taught.
Right.
And so, like I said, I sometimes will just wind it up out of humor, or I'll just mess with people to see what I can get them to say. I shouldn't admit this on air, but I'll do it now.
Well, I
Um,
think actually, let me recast that because I think that there's a positive light in there. Is that someone likes to talk about themselves and they're charismatic, they're interesting, so you're getting curious and asking about themselves to learn. It's like if I'm going to
oh,
listen to this podcast, might as well get something out of it, which is enjoy, like getting more curious and just getting curious about what the answers are. So that's like, if I'm in this relationship, at least I might as well get some more information out of it.
yeah, no, I mean that's what I do. But honestly, I'll be in conversations with people when it comes to ideas. I'm so extroverted, and that's this
Yeah.
piece of narcissism where I'll start over talking people, and I can see myself do it. I'm like, oh my God, I'm a horrible person. I got to just dial it back so I get it. But I try to say, how do I turn, like, if they're just going to talk about themselves, how do I make that TV show interesting for me? Or, like, how do I
Right.
make this podcast I'm being forced to listen to interesting for me? That's a good way to put it. Yeah, this isn't a conversation. Turns out it's a
Don't even think it's a
podcast.
conversation.
Turns out we're having a podcast. What do I want to hear in this podcast?
Yeah, make it,
That's
you go to interviewer mode.
go to interview mode. Yeah.
You're the interviewer of the expert on whatever
Yeah.
because they believe that they were expert on them, and you just talk about it that way.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that's what I kind of try to do, but it's really just being,
Well, I
I don't
sometimes
mind.
I fantasize, maybe because I'm a narcissist at the heart, but I fantasize around like, so it feels like we've been talking a lot about you, and I need to
Yeah.
have a little bit about this being with me. And it's interesting because when I have a dear friend who's like that, I'm like, listen, I can't talk about you right now. I'm having a problem, so like I can't talk about you. Like kind of,
Yeah.
don't you know that 90% of the time we talk about you, but like today it cannot be about that. Is that an effective strategy?
Uh,
Could that work?
Well, it's what happens because, when you're bringing this up, narcissism, people talk about themselves a lot. But they do the same in depression. So people who are depressed
Um,
or anxious will often talk about themselves a lot. And there's a whole
mm,
area of therapy like about this. But what seems to happen is people who do all this self-talk or talk about themselves all the time who are depressed will drive their friends away. Because
mm,
it's all, and so what you're saying is, look, man, I'd love to hear about you, but I just can't do it today. You know,
right.
And that's a challenge for people, because this sort of people that always need to talk about themselves. So with narcissism, it's kind of entertaining and amusing, but with depression, sometimes it's really people just, I just need to talk, and it never works. And they'll end up losing relationships and make their own depression work. Same way people are narcissistic, become bores, and like, we don't want Keith at the party. All he does is talk about himself. What a loser.
Right.
And people make fun of you behind your back and don't invite you to parties. You get isolated. And I think the same, it's sort of
Mm.
like depression, but on the opposite side of it.
Right. You're like, I don't want to have that person at the dinner party because they'll monopolize the dinner party and it will be awful, and I can't deal with that.
Right.
But it's interesting because some people who I've like, are they? So I sat through a whole gym workout with someone who is convinced that her husband was a narcissist, and she had all these, like, she wanted to spend the whole session when we were working out, and they're like, when you're working out with a pair, like, there's nowhere you can go. You're like, you're doing
You're just
push-ups.
trapped.
You're like, I'm stuck here. So it's, and then the whole thing was so ironic, and I thought, wow, you're talking about how your husband is a narcissist, yet you have like spent this entire session talking about how your husband is a narcissist and getting rageful, angry, can't stop talking about it, then like give examples and like, I could be like, yeah, my dad died, be like, that reminds me of my husband and how he, and it's like, what is
Yeah.
going on here? Uh, uh,
Yeah.
is that narcissism or is that just like anger, depression, anxiousness?
Pain, pain and depression can look like narcissism. When
Ah,
people
okay.
get super wounded or super painful, they get very self-centered sometimes.
Okay. All right. So that's
And
and that's actually an important distinction because it
yeah,
looks like they're being a narcissist and it's really just like,
yeah.
please get
So
this out of me.
yes, self-centeredness, if you go back in depression literature, it's something that gets with people depressed. They can't think of themselves out of their own room. They think everything's about them. They think their life is so bad. So you do find self-centeredness with depression, for sure.
Ah, okay. So that's a different feeling than
Yes.
narcissism
Yes. Yeah. I don't mean to be
because
even more confusing, but it just
no,
kind
no,
of
I think it helps
is.
because it's kind of like I'm like, well, this is ironic because you seem totally
Yeah.
narcissistic because you're just talking about yourself the whole time. But really, it was about pain and anxiety and depression and needing to talk it out. Is that what they're doing?
Oh, I think it's, well, I mean, some of this becomes ruminative, meaning in the term, we use the term rumination in psychology, which comes from ruminants, like cows that just chew on their cud all the time. So some of what's
Mm,
going on in these discussions are rumination, meaning they're talking about themselves, but they're not making actual progress. They're just sort of
mm,
spinning the ideas in their head. And it's
mm,
not helpful because they're not using causal language. They're not like, okay, I'm done. I'm bailing on this marriage. I solved it, CJ. They're just kind of going and running in a circle. And
mm.
that's where you see it. It's not really helpful. You're just generating a bunch of negative emotion and getting stuck there.
Yeah, I mean, in that particular case, it feels like you're not doing a service for having them kind of ruminate more.
No, I mean, all you're doing is allowing them to activate a bunch of negative emotion associated with themselves and their family. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not super helpful.
Yeah, so it's interesting because how is that different than psychology and talk therapy where you're just allowing someone to ruminate about their negative emotions?
Well, and if you're a therapist, you're supposed to be looking at thoughts, dissecting thoughts, giving people insight to thoughts, and then giving them tools to kind of work the way out of it. So hopefully, if your friend had been in some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy with one of my young smart students, they'd be told that, like, hey, this thought is destructive, and when this comes out, maybe we can replace it with that, or maybe we can, instead, when you start going down this thinking, let's focus on something positive about you. Let's focus on maybe we're going to learn Spanish instead of thinking about our husband or whatever.
Right.
So they're really going to try to analyze these patterns of thinking that are destructive and come up with new patterns of thinking that are helpful. Rumination
Interesting.
is not helpful. it
Right.
is it is it's like being aggressive and punching a picture of the person you're angry at. It doesn't help. It makes you feel good for a second, and it trains you to be aggressive.
Ah,
And
interesting.
it's so this stuff,
Interesting.
it can be destructive.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that helps in trying to figure out the the variances of what people I've been told, they go around, it's like people throw this term around as narcissist, and it could be just depression, anxiety, and
Yes.
ruminating about things. And that looks very similar to
Hmm.
narcissism because the person is hogging the time, but it could be something actually very different.
Right. So are they being mean to you when they're hogging the time? Are they doing it for attention? Or are they in pain?
Yeah,
And that's kind of the question. If somebody's in pain, then it's not narcissism, it's pain. And pain has self-centeredness to it. When I'm sick, I am the biggest baby on earth. I'm
right.
just a little crybaby who wants affection and attention. And my wife tells me this a lot, so I know it. That is, that is just, I mean, that's just, that's just pain.
Right. Versus kind of like, I'm trying to show you how great I am.
Yeah,
That's narcissism.
I'm trying to show how important I am or my status or how special I am, or I'm doing this to be mean. So I'm talking about my relationship, but I'm really doing this to you, CJ, because I know you don't have a relationship. So I'm talking about my bad relationship, but I'm doing this really because it makes you feel even worse
Right.
because I can just so you can be doing you can be doing the same behavior with sort of different motivation behind it as well.
Interesting. And I think that that's really important distinction because I think a lot of people think others are narcissistic and they're really just in
In pain.
pain or some other kind of, or anxious and need to kind of process out loud and move to a different place. But if you kind of just listen to it and just hold space, that's one thing. Maybe that is relieving, but if you keep on hearing the same ruminations over and over again, then it's just ruminating without moving forward. I like it.
Spinning your
Okay.
wheels. Yeah.
Yes, I like it. This has been so fascinating, and I got some really good tips for myself
Good.
because I need to get something out of this because it's
I
basically
got
about
I got
me.
a few I got a few for me. I'm using that podcast thing forever.
Love it. We've been talking to Keith Campbell, who's a professor of psychology of the University of Georgia and the author of The New Science of Narcissism. Thank you so much. It was really actually very, very delightful and fun and very educational, really interesting.
Oh, thanks, CJ. That was great.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.